Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending the fifth of our OpenSecrets Lobbying Masterclass sessions. I'm Daniel Auble. I manage the OpenSecrets federal lobbying and revolving door projects. I'm joined today by Pete Quist, our Deputy Research Director, who's an expert on disclosure of money in state politics. And also joining us is Olivia Buckley, an OpenSecrets researcher who is doing extensive work on our new issue center, which she'll tell us a little bit about. And also thank you to our media team who will help run the Q&A. Speaking of which, we will have time at the end for questions, so please drop any you have as we go along in the Q&A chat, the Q&A feature of Zoom. And also note that we are recording this session and we'll post it later. So we'd also like to thank the Midyar Network for their support of this series and our work in general of analyzing and combining lobbying data at both the state and federal level. For anyone who is still not familiar with OpenSecrets, we are the leading money in politics data organization. We're nonprofit and nonpartisan, and we now collect disclosures from both the national or federal level and the 50 states, ranging from things like campaign contributions to campaign expenditures, spending on ballot measures at the state level, and of course, lobbying and revolving door. This series was designed to educate you on what data is available, how to use lobbying disclosure reports in your work, hopefully. And today we'll focus on the lobbying activities of big tech. We'll touch on the basics of lobbying data, but I would encourage you to watch some of our previous sessions on different topics, especially the first one we did, which is a more thorough introduction to what lobbying is in general, what information about it gets reported, where, and when it's available, and a pretty thorough demonstration of what tools OpenSecrets has that you can use. We have one more session on November 15th, where we'll look at a variety of social issues and some topics that we haven't really covered yet. So I encourage you to register for that final session. And with that, I'll hand off to Pete to get us started.
Thanks, Dan. So we're here talking today about lobbying. And as Dan mentioned, there will be time for Q&A at the end. You have access to a Q&A box in your Zoom bar. So feel free to pop questions in there as we go, and we will answer those at the end. So lobbying, we're going to be defining here as the efforts to sway public policy by talking to congresspersons or state legislators and elected office holders. Lobbying is regulated differently in different places, and how much information is disclosed about lobbying varies from place to place. At the federal level, we have really quite good disclosure of how much money clients are paying firms to represent them, and we provide that information, and Dan will be talking about the tech industry payments of that sort here in just a moment. At the state level, we see quite a bit of variation. So in some cases, we see how much clients are paying to be represented, and in some cases we don't. And there's more information about this in our first webinar. I'll drop a link to that in the chat here in just a moment. So we collect this data at the federal level and also in 19 states currently. And in both our federal and state data, we classify clients, those organizations that are trying to influence public policy, based on their industry. And so we'll be looking at the tech industry here today. Lobbying is really the main point of engaging in public policy for many for-profit interests like the ones we're going to be looking at today. We also track, as Dan mentioned, campaign contributions, independent expenditures, and so forth. Campaign contributions are really meant to sort of open the door for lobbying when those contributions are coming from organizational interests like corporate PACs or where permitted corporations directly. So we're looking here at kind of the efforts following up on those contributions and how much these organizations are spending to influence policy, which sometimes is quite a bit more than they actually pay in campaign contributions as well. So with that, Dan, I'll hand it to you to talk about the federal data, and then I'll jump in and talk about the state.
Thanks. So I'll start by kind of describing what we mean when we talk about tech in terms of lobbying. What is commonly thought of as tech really falls into two of our industry categories. We have an internet industry, which includes things like Facebook and Amazon, Netflix, Twitter, Google is there. And then we also have an electronics manufacturing and related services where you'll find things like software companies, companies that actually manufacture computers and parts of computers, like chip manufacturers of semiconductors and the like, as well as like IT services. So some of the big players in that category are Oracle and Microsoft, Apple. So those are kind of the categories we're talking about. You'll mostly find them separated on the website, but of course, at any time you can get in contact with us and we can give you combined figures if necessary. Now, to get into some of the lobbying activities of these groups, to start with the internet industry, not too long ago, the main storyline with these companies really was the pace at which they were becoming a powerhouse in terms of political influence efforts. The last decade, you saw them rocket really from near obscurity to being one of the most well-funded and connected industries in Washington. Just looking at this is the industry profile in terms of lobbying for them. You can see with this historical graph of their lobbying spending how really over the 20 teens, they went from a pretty small level of expenditure to a very large one. And they now also have, looking at the top spenders overall, have usually 3 or 4 of the top 20 spenders overall on lobbying. In the first half of 2023, they have, 3 of them are on this list, being Amazon, Meta / Facebook, and Alphabet / Google. So this industry does not have the reluctance to engage in politics the way Microsoft did, for example, in the 90s. They really held off getting involved as long as possible. And then they got caught flat-footed when they were faced with a lot of antitrust attention. But more recently, it seems they've kind of reached their a plateau at these higher levels to some extent, though it continues to rise somewhat. Google, as in particular, has somewhere around 2019 seems to have made a decision to spend a little bit less. So their spending went down in 2019 and has since settled into a consistently lower, though still very large level, around $12 million a year, as opposed to the last the period before that, when they were spending more like $15 to $18 million a year. To take a look at the electronics manufacturing and equipment industry, they are bigger. You'll see there's about 4 times as many organizations lobbying within their category, and they're more established and tend to be older companies, which is reflected in the issues and bills that they're lobbying on. The electronics and manufacturing group tends to focus more and prioritize big spending bills. And I'm actually going to switch over to issues here, like appropriations and the defense bills. Homeland Security is on their list, as they provide services to the government in many cases. Like Amazon and Microsoft were both competing for an enormous cloud computing contract with the Pentagon, just as one example. But when you look at more internet-based companies, they show a comparatively high interest in topics like intellectual property and consumer issues, which of course are more intimately tied to what they do, dealing with data privacy and their use of their products by minors and that kind of thing. And then there are, of course, some lobbying efforts that are specific to a certain company. I feel like more in this industry than many others. We reported just a few weeks ago about Google's lobbying around the DOJ antitrust effort against them, as well as a few months ago, we looked at ByteDance's increased spending as the idea of banning TikTok because of its connections to China periodically gains steam or kind of fades into the background. Now I will show you some of the resources we have in more detail. I'll start with that industry page for the internet industry, where you can, as I pointed out, get an idea of their historical spending, the patterns over time, and also what companies make up that industry. So you'll see here many that I mentioned, as well as some like eBay and even foreign companies like Alibaba. But let's take a look at ByteDance here as a good example, a very stark example of a new player arriving on the scene and really ramping up their spending as their business and then scrutiny of it grew. You can see in the last 4 years, they have established roughly a $5 million operation, and that looks like it might double this year as even more focus has been drawn to the company. And they have dozens of lobbyists now working their issues. The very ability to exist and do business in the US is, of course, their top priority and really the reason for that increase. But that phalanx of lobbyists they have, if we look at some of them in more detail, they nearly all have a past job where they worked for the federal government. That's what this 90% of the lobbyists they've hired are revolvers, meaning they've worked for the government in the past. And all of those people who have been through the revolving door are marked by these circular arrow icons. You can filter this list to just look at at people who have been through the revolving door, as well as just those who are former members of Congress. And ByteDance clearly has some well-connected lobbyists here. They have 4 former members of Congress working for them. But I'll just click on this revolving door icon for Freddie Barnes to give you an idea of what you'll see. You get an idea of everywhere he's worked. He was not too long ago working for the Kevin McCarthy's campaign and the NRCC, which is the main House side fundraising vehicle. Those are, that McCarthy job was maybe a little more valuable a few weeks ago, but this still gives you an idea that they're targeting political operatives with connections to lobby on their behalf. Going back to the full list, we'll take a look at another person to show you their profile. So looking at a lobbyist profile, this is an individual person who's registered as a lobbyist. You can look and see what other clients they represent, if they work for a lobbying firm, and sometimes you'll see someone who works for a bunch of tech companies or has a more diverse portfolio. You can also get an idea of what contributions they've made personally to political campaigns and PACs. So again, this gives you an idea of what connections they have, what members they might be targeting, and just a more complete picture of the operation that ByteDance is trying to put together. Also, looking at an individual lobbyist, you can see what issues they tend to work on, if maybe they're very specialized or have a broader experience. Returning to the ByteDance profile, we also have information here on what issues and bills the company is reporting working on, similar to the spreadsheet list that I showed you earlier of bills and issues. We also here have links to the original filings under report images, where you can go see the actual form that was filed, as well as what agencies they targeted. Now, pretty much every report lists the House and the Senate, so those are kind of a given. But the executive branch agencies can be interesting if there's maybe something you weren't expecting to see on that list, or just to confirm that they're actually contacting officials at these agencies to lobby them. I also want to just quickly point out the search functions, which you'll find on the side of every page in the lobbying section. I covered kind of the functions of the search in a little bit more detail in a previous webinar, so I would encourage you to go back and watch those. But you can do a keyword search here, and you'll get results among the companies paying for lobbying firms, bills, our industry list. It searches all those things at once and gives you kind of a unified results page that you can then very easily filter down to which category of search results you're interested in. So definitely check that out. But that is a very quick overview of what we have for federal lobbying. And now I'll hand it off to Pete again to talk about the state level.
Thanks, Dan. I'll share my screen here. So at the state level, our lobbying, screen share, sorry about that. At the state level, our lobbying, as I mentioned, encompasses 19 states. And we currently host that data on followthemoney.org. This data will be migrating over to OpenSecrets.org soon as well. To look at the lobbying, there are a couple of ways to get in. My preferred method is through this Ask Anything button, which allows you to examine any data set that we collect at the state level. By clicking on that, I'll click on the option to change from contributions data to lobbying expenditure data. And I'm just going to go ahead and click Go here, and we're going to pull up all of our state level lobbying spending. If I click on the filing jurisdiction option here, this basically will group up the data that we have by state. And so this is looking at state level lobbying spending over all of the years that we collect, which is consistent for these states going back to 2015 and going further back for some of them as well. And so these are states where that compensation piece, how much these tech companies and other clients are paying to be represented, is reported and easily available for us to collect. So here's our list of states for lobbying disclosure. To get into the tech industry, I will run a modification to the search. We're going to look at spending from the tech industry. It's going to be under communications and electronics here. And the industries I'm going to be pulling up are the electronics manufacturing and services and computer equipment and services, which includes our internet code here. And I'm going to look at spending in the last 8 or 9 years or so. Back to 2015 when we have a consistent number of states. That takes a few seconds to load, so I've preloaded it here. So we have the state level lobbying spending by those industries in the selected years. And then this is a breakdown of how much money's been spent by this industry in each state. So California leads the way here, followed by Florida, Texas, and New York. Not too surprising, these are states with highly expensive politics. And then we have Massachusetts come in, which is not typically one of the highest expense states in the country. So that's kind of an interesting one to come up. Washington has some tech companies located there. And so I'm not overly surprised to see this West Coast starting to show up as well. But you get a breakdown of how much is being spent by the industry in each state. Looking over the years, we see, unlike the federal spending, the state spending has been pretty static. 2023 data is, of course, still coming in, so we'll expect that to get up at this point, probably in the same ballpark as 2021 and 2022, the low to mid $20 million. So pretty level over the last decade or so. And then a breakdown of state and year. And so we've seen that actually, although California is where most of the money's been spent overall, there have been a couple of years here where tech industry spending has spiked in a couple of other states, New York and Texas specifically. And then we can break down also who these spenders are. So Google tops the list for us, Google Alphabet, followed by Microsoft and Meta or Facebook. And then we see some other familiar names as well. I will note that ByteDance does not appear here. They have not, so far as we've been able to see, engaged in state lobbying yet. At the state level, we don't always get information about who is being paid. So sometimes we have how much the client is paying, but not necessarily who they're paying. So there are some cases here where we'll see the recipients of the money being not identified. Sometimes that's just a product of the way that the states make digital data available. You can get further into PDFs or something like that and see who's being paid. But then we get a breakdown of firms here that are being paid by the tech industry. We have found in looking at state level lobbying that the lobbying firms that work at the state level tend to be firms that work specifically in one state. There are some exceptions. Ballard Partners is going to be a familiar name for some of you, located in Florida and also lobbying at the federal level. But typically, these firms are state specific. And this really goes to sort of Dan's point about how ByteDance is hiring a lot of former congresspersons or senior congressional staff in that revolving door measure. The point of these firms is to have good connections. They're not necessarily, and generally aren't, issue experts for what they're lobbying on, but they're paid to really have connections to the elected officials. And that's why we see these firms kind of specialize within a state or sometimes within a small region because those relationships are really what they're getting paid to take advantage of. So at the federal level, we're able to look at specific bills or issue areas that an industry or a client is lobbying on. That's a little harder at the state level. It is available in some places, but not very many. And sometimes it's not available in a very usable format. In California, for example, you can look at what bills or what information, what policies are being lobbied on by a client, but it's a big memo field that will just have paragraphs of stuff in it and isn't very easy to parse. So it isn't displayed here. But that is available from time to time. So if you're working on a story about lobbying by the tech industry at the state level, we may be able to help you identify some of that, some of those bills that they're working on and who they're talking to in some cases. So please do feel free to reach out to us for at any time on that. We may have some information we can share. It just may not be very clean looking, but we can talk about how that goes and what it looks like. There is also a bill search by the National Conference of State Legislatures that allows you to look at bills by industry or by issue area, I mean. And so we can do this 50 state bill tracking database, which you get to by clicking on the resources tab on their website and then research and policy and the bill tracking. And in this way, you can look at some of the issues, including some tech issues where bills are being considered in the various states currently, or even in past years if you're doing some historical research. So this is a resource to be aware of, and I'll include a link to it in our follow-up email after this webinar. The general issues that tech companies are lobbying on at the state level are somewhat similar to what they are at the federal level, though. So these are data privacy issues and the like. We are doing an examination of the tech industry, a more in-depth examination, as part of a broader push for an issue-based entrance into campaign finance data and lobbying data. We're cognizant that these data sets are kind of wonky, and to make lobbying data and campaign finance data more accessible to journalists and to the public, we're opening a door to enter in through more of an issue-based approach. And for that, I will pass the ball to Olivia to talk about our upcoming work in that project.
Hey everyone. So I'm Olivia Buckley. I am the dedicated researcher on the Issues Center project at OpenSecrets. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we have in store for the future of this project. I'm also going to share a little bit about our first issue profile from earlier this summer on cryptocurrency. So the goal of this project broadly, as Pete mentioned, is to create a series of issue profiles that consolidate our data around specific issues and provide a little bit of additional context and insight to help make that data as accessible as it can be to the general public, as well as to members of the media or other organizations who might be able to make good use of it. One of the really exciting elements of this project is going to be more extensive data visualization. We're hoping to incorporate federal and state data, which should go a long way towards encouraging readers of the website to start to explore that data on their own and understand some of the narratives that can emerge around these issues from our angle of money and politics and these sort of networks of influence. As part of that, we'll be including trends in lobbying, but also contributions and outside spending, as well as policy developments that can help sort of shed some light on those trends. Also, in conjunction with the issue profiles, we're planning to partner with media and advocacy organizations to offer training on how they might be able to use some of our data in their own work. So while I'm introducing this work, I wanted to take just a moment to talk about the profile that we published earlier this summer on cryptocurrency. This is a little bit of kind of a light version of what we have in mind for future issue profiles. So it's not going to have as much as the kind of interactive element that I mentioned. But I do still think that it's an exciting resource for an issue that can be pretty difficult, in my experience, to grasp. And in the context of what we're talking about today, crypto is a pretty interesting issue because it relies on decentralized ledgers that are maintained by its users. And it's typically framed by its proponents as a democratizing force. So there's sort of a natural tension that exists between proponents of blockchain technology and the kind of established tech giants that you've heard Dan and Pete talk about today. In the past couple of years, there have also been a series of pretty major blows to the crypto industry and loss of value that put its future into question. The FTX bankruptcy proceedings that are ongoing and more recent FTC lawsuits against Coinbase and Binance are a couple of big ones there. And that's also been reflected to some extent in the relationship between big tech and crypto. So for example, Meta announced in 2022 that they would begin supporting integration of NFTs on Facebook and Instagram. And then they turned around and reversed that decision earlier this year, less than a year after the initial announcement. That being said, blockchain technology, which is what provides the technological underpinnings for cryptocurrencies, does have potential applications beyond just crypto. So big tech companies like Google, Microsoft, and Amazon Web Services are definitely invested in and continuing to offer blockchain products. So if you're interested to learn more about that, I would really encourage you to check out the crypto profile. It's up on the website right now. And also be on the lookout for future issue profiles and coverage of big tech coming up down the line. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Dan.
Yes, thank you, Olivia. So I'll remind you, if you have any questions, throw them in the Q&A function now. I do want to just emphasize the fact that we've been illustrating a lot of what's available on the website for you to access at any time, but we also are happy to do custom requests. We try our hardest to keep them free of charge as long as they're not super complicated or time consuming. So, and we also are happy to give background on laws and regulations and what the data can tell you and what maybe it can't. So feel free to reach out to us at any time. We're happy to help. And with that, I'll ask our media team if we have any questions to answer.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, one initial question, and again, if you want to post more questions in the chat or through the Q&A, that's amazing. But for a first initial question, this one's for you, Pete. Could you elaborate more on how to find information about what a company is lobbying on?
Yeah, so I noted that it's a little bit more challenging at the state level in many cases to find specific bills, but that there is some availability of that information. I will note also that sometimes the states make that information required to be reported, but not always as available in their data sets. So we can certainly help you find more detail in a lobbying report that may not be available through a bulk data download, which is how we collect most of this lobbying spending work. So we can certainly help guide you with that if you're looking at trying to find out what a company is trying to influence in a specific state. Another resource that is worth keeping in mind is the state legislative websites themselves. So our lobbying data at the state level typically comes from ethics agencies or some sort of an agency that is charged with registering lobbyists and requiring them to file, or the clients to file reports on how much they're spending and what they're working on and that sort of thing. The legislative bodies themselves will have information on testimony in committees, for example, in legislative committees. And those will be oftentimes organized by bill or issue, so you can see which companies are sending a representative to testify on a piece of legislation, and oftentimes even get their testimony. We published a report last year looking in depth at the pharmaceutical companies and the healthcare industry lobbying at the federal and state level. And we found that much of the testimony by the different lobbying firms hired in each state, again, usually state-specific firms, was actually quite identical. The bills that are being considered in a given state are going to resemble each other in many cases, and the testimony that these companies will be submitting to the states is oftentimes pretty similar from state to state. In fact, we found even in that pharmaceutical examination, sometimes the testimony was the same. If they submitted written testimony, it was even in the same font and so forth. So just a copy and paste, which is kind of helpful too, because you can get sort of a sneak preview of what a company is going to be saying when they're trying to work on a piece of legislation, if you can find a similar piece of legislation through, say, that NCSL bill list. So there are some options out there.
Great, thank you. Here's one for you, Dan. So you mentioned that 90% of ByteDance lobbyists are revolvers. Is that very unusual?
Yeah, that one is particularly high. However, I'm not sure off the top of my head what the average is, but most industries, you'll see something like 70%. So that's both reflecting the fact that a lot of the people with policy experience have worked in the government at one time or another, but also just the prevalence of these connections between both the Hill and the regulating agencies who are making rules and policies that affect these businesses, and the lobbying teams that are then turning around and trying to influence what decisions they do make. So while that ByteDance one is probably one of the highest rates, the prevalence of revolvers is high across all industries, really.
Great, thank you. One more on ByteDance. So Pete, you noted that ByteDance does not appear to be active in state lobbying despite lobbying at the federal level. Is that typical?
So most of the companies that we see in the list that Dan was showing and the list that I was showing kind of appear in both at some point. It is somewhat unusual that we have a company lobbying at the federal level that doesn't appear anywhere in our state data. And ByteDance does not appear anywhere in our state data. They don't appear in campaign contributions, in lobbying, in any aspect of our state data so far. Granted, our lobbying data is limited to those 19 or 20 states, but still we would expect them to appear typically. However, when companies just start to begin to engage in politics, sometimes they will take an approach of focusing at the federal level. I would expect ByteDance to start lobbying at the state level as well eventually. We have seen some cases too where companies will start to lobby in a specific state. A domestic company, unlike ByteDance, might start to lobby in a state in which it's formed. So some of these tech companies may have started lobbying in California specifically until they grew and their business began taking place in more than one state. So it's pretty unusual, but not entirely unheard of.
Great, thank you. One more for you, Pete. So what is the time delay from the lobbying activities and the reporting of the money? Do states have monthly or quarterly filings?
So every state gets to decide how often lobbying is reported, which is a great puzzle. At the federal level, lobbying is reported quarterly. That's a pretty typical model. So a lot of states will have quarterly reporting. However, some will do semi-annual reporting, and some will do monthly reporting. And then there'll be some variation even from those kinds of things. We get that lobbying data as quickly as we can. In an odd year like this one, 2023, we're pretty good at getting it pretty quickly. We do collect this data where it's available digitally, so we aren't actually keying in paper reports, which is helpful, where we do have to do that for a lot of campaign finance reports in some of the states. So that helps to reduce the lag. However, it is constantly a juggle. We've just got a few people collecting the data. So as deadlines pass, we try to get that as quickly as we can. But a delay will typically be at least a few days just to normalize the data into our database, and sometimes a little bit longer during an election year in particular, where we're juggling a lot of campaign finance reports in addition to lobbying. So it can be a little bit longer. If you're working on a story within a state or within the states in general, we can talk about how complete we are in terms of the data for your story.
That is actually a great segue into one more question. So we've looked at how much tech companies have spent across states, but can we dive into how much, say, a specific company is spending in a specific state, or who they're paying in that state?
Yeah, actually, I'll share my screen again for that. So this is our tab that we were looking at with the spending from the tech industry by spender. And so this was looking across states and across these years. The magnifying lens on the left side of any row that you generate in any table will actually allow you to dive into that information, making up that row. So the spending by Google for $16 million here. If we click on the magnifying lens there, we can actually just look at Google spending and see where they're spending most of their money. Again, not overly surprising in California, but then if we wanted to look at their spending in Massachusetts, for example, diving into that magnifying lens there will allow us to look at Google spending in Massachusetts. And so then we can start seeing how much they've spent each year and who their recipients are. So who are the firms that they're hiring? So Morrissey & Associates seems to be their go-to firm here. And then a couple of specific lobbyists, potentially in-house lobbyists that are being listed individually here. But Morrissey & Associates looks like their big one. So we can certainly see that information looking at a company and seeing exactly who they're paying and how much in a state in a given year. We can also look at, back to our original query here for state level lobbying by the industries across years and states. If we wanted to look at a specific state, we can do that. I'll pick on Connecticut this time. And so now by clicking on the magnifying lens, I'm just looking at that Connecticut tech industry money. And we can see who the tech industry spenders are in Connecticut over the years that we've selected in this query, that 2015 to 2023, and see who those top spenders are. And then we can even break down within those which firms they're hiring as well. So Connecticut doesn't have as good of firm reporting, so we don't always get to see that, but this is available as well, so you can dive in to the detail.
Great, thank you, Pete. One more question for you, Dan. So do we have a way of tracking, or is there a way of tracking how revolving door former government officials are going into tech companies as shadow lobbyists who are not necessarily registered? Do we have any tools to track that?
Yes. So much of what's in our revolving door database does come from lobbying registrations. So we have probably more complete data on registered lobbyists. However, there is an aspect of the data collection for that where we go looking for certain industries, major executives or members of their government affairs team that maybe don't show up on the lobbying reports, and investigate their past employment history. And then, of course, we're also just generally keeping our eyes open when people change jobs and leave the Hill, for instance. So you will find people in the revolving door database that don't necessarily register to lobby. And especially with high profile people, members of Congress in particular, often will go take lucrative jobs on K Street as senior advisors where they don't register to lobby, but they're clearly advising on policy and advising on which offices to contact and which members might be most receptive and all that, even though they don't lobby. So we do include some of those people in the revolving door database for sure.
Great, thank you. And one more for you, Pete. Is there any lobbying data available from OpenSecrets in states that we have not looked at today?
Yeah, so I noted that the spending disclosure at the state level is somewhat different from state to state, and in some states, not very good information is reported. The states that we didn't look at today are mostly, although not entirely, states where how much money those clients, those tech companies and other clients are paying to be represented is not reported in those states. And that's the lion's share of the money spent on lobbying. How much a client pays a firm or a lobbyist to represent that client is typically around 90% of the money spent on lobbying, whereas the other 10% is the things that you think about with traditional lobbying activities, like holding luncheons and lobbyist parking or whatever. That typically is a very small percentage, up to maybe 10% of the money spent on lobbying, where we can see both kinds of spending being reported at the state level. In the states where we are unable to collect lobbying spending information, largely again those states where that compensation piece is not reported, we do still collect the registrations. And so we can see which clients are hiring which firms or lobbyists to represent them. We do collect that in all 50 states. It is not as searchable on our followthemoney.org website, but is available in a data set that we can provide. So always feel free to reach out to us. It's not as useful as the spending, because the spending is really a direct measurement of how much a company is trying to influence policy, or is about as direct as you can really get, because that company is measuring how much it thinks its lobbyists are worth in terms of influencing public policy by spending that amount of money. But we can at least see who the companies are hiring and how many lobbyists in many cases are working on behalf of that company. So there is some information out there, and sometimes even in the states where the spending is not required to be reported in any kind of meaningful way, you may still be able to get information about what bills or issues a company is working on.
Great, thanks again. And with that, I will let you close this out.
All right, I do want to make a note that we are beginning a media partnerships kind of push. So this is for those of you who are focused on tech industry work to you, but also even more broadly. So of course, many of you are not focused specifically on the tech industry, but are reporting on public issues in a broader context. We would like to talk about what a partnership might look like in many cases. So this is kind of new to us, so I don't have a lot of specifics to offer, but doing database collaborations or cross-publishing, that kind of thing, may be something that we can talk about. And I will drop in our primary contact for that, although you can reach out to me or Dan. You'll have our emails in your inboxes. You can reach out to us directly, or if you'd like, you can reach out to Tim Sandler, who we will put you in touch with if you reach out to us. And I've just dropped his email into the chat. And he is our media partnerships lead and starting to form that program for us. So highly encourage, if you're interested, highly encourage you to reach out, and we can talk about what that might look like and how to get good journalism more widely distributed. With that, I want to thank everyone for coming. Thanks again for the Omidyar Network for helping us with our lobbying data collection and integration, and have a wonderful rest of the week.